Under the Speaker's announced policy of January 6, 2015, the gentlewoman from Virginia, Mrs. Comstock, is recognized for 60 minutes as the designee of the Majority Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Before I begin, I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous materials on the subject of the special order.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This special order is meant to honor the life and decades of service of Associate Justice of the United States Supreme Court, Antonin Scalia. Justice Scalia was a person of great joy, great intellect, great wit, and great faith. Our nation suffered a tremendous loss on February 13th with the passing of Justice Antonin Scalia. My husband Chip and I, my parents, and our children are deeply saddened by the passing of our friend, our neighbor, and, of course, a legal legend. He was a courageous advocate for the rule of law and the Constitution. Justice Scalia and his wife, Maureen, raised an incredible family of 9 children and 36 grandchildren, and we have been so privileged to know and love them. Justice Scalia was both a larger-than-life justice who leaves a profound legacy in the law, as well as a down-to-earth husband, father, grandfather, an absolutely delightful friend who loved his Lord and God, his wife and family, the law, the opera, his country, hunting, and a good laugh. We have all heard the stories of his friendship across the ideological spectrum, none more famous than his friendship with Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Justice Scalia explained, quote, "If you can't disagree ardently with your colleagues about some issues of law and yet personally still be friends, get another job for Pete's sake." Justice Ginsburg explained, quote, "As annoyed as you might be about his zinging dissent, he's so utterly charming, so amusing, so sometimes outrageous, you can't help but say, I'm glad that he's my friend or he's my colleague." Justice Scalia was a shining example of fidelity as he was ever faithful to his oath in the law, to his family, and to his God. He was celebrated so many in the legal community, a revered mentor to the dozens and dozens of clerks who lined the steps of the Supreme Court last Friday in his honor. And every one of them, no doubt, had a story that had profound legal discussions in it, but also ended with a good laugh. He simply will be irreplaceable and leaves a legacy that will be consequential and discussed and debated for the ages. On the personal front, his life was also a great and consequential life. Justice Scalia married his wife of over 55 years, Maureen, in 1960. They were set up on a blind date. He told one author that Maureen was, quote, "the product of the best decision I ever made." His 9 children, 9, how appropriate for a Supreme Court justice, were split 5-4, 5 boys, 4 girls. They became lawyers, a priest, a poet, an Army major, and parents themselves of those wonderful 36 grandchildren. Justice Scalia proudly gave the lion's share of the credit for raising this large brood to the resourceful, talented, and very smart love of his life, who, as her son Paul said in the homily, matched him at every step. And Maureen, he said, and their children, about the children, Justice Scalia said, quote, "and there's not a dullard in the bunch." His son, Father Paul Scalia, was the celebrant for his father's beautiful funeral mass with assistance of dozens of priests at the Basilica of the National Shrine of the Immaculate Conception this past Saturday. Father Paul began his moving homily saying, quote, "We are gathered here because of one man, a man known personally to many of us, known only by reputation to many more, a man loved by many, scorned by others, a man known for great controversy and for great compassion. That man, of course, is Jesus of Nazareth." Father Paul continued, In the past week, many have recounted what Dad did for them, but here today, we reflect what God did for Dad, how he blessed him. Father Paul explained how his father understood that the deeper he went into his Catholic faith, the better a citizen and public servant he became. That faith now inspires his children and grandchildren and generations to come of the Scalia family and the so many lives he touched and influenced. Justice Scalia also had a rich tenor voice that intimidated many who came before the court in front of him, but as his son Christopher explained, it was also perfect for reading stories to his grandchildren. His rendition of The Night Before Christmas was an annual tradition. He also led many sing-alongs at parties, played the piano, and also that singing would go on for their long car rides. Pictures with his children and grandchildren cover the walls and the end tables and the piano of the Scalia home. And in any picture with one or more of those children or grandchildren, or with his beloved Maureen, Justice Scalia would always be beaming whenever he was around his family. An only child himself, he loved that he gave his children the gift of many brothers and sisters. No doubt that is a great solace to all of them now, as well as a source of great strength and support for their mother. May God bless Justice Antonin Scalia, a good and faithful son, and may God bless his wife, Maureen, and their entire family, and the scores and scores of their friends and his colleagues, and the millions more of admirers, and may God bless the country that he so loved. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I would now like to yield from the gentleman from Virginia and the distinguished chairman of the Judiciary Committee, Mr. Goodlatte.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to especially thank Congresswoman Comstock for leading this tribute to Justice Scalia. The nation's legal lights faded recently with the loss of the great Supreme Court Justice Antonin Scalia, but they will not be dimmed for long. For Justice Scalia left a legacy of illumination that will continue far beyond his mortal years. Although Justice Scalia is no longer with us on earth, his cogent, witty, and plain-spoken writings will continue to educate law students and good citizens everywhere for centuries to come. Justice Scalia was no mere legal technician. He was a deep thinker who had an uncommon knack for crystallizing powerful ideas into trenchant, lasting prose. The journey on which he led his readers was always a joy, always compelling, because Justice Scalia always made clear where the path started. He once said, "More important than your obligation to follow your conscience, or at least prior to it, is your obligation to form your conscience correctly." And for Justice Scalia, as with morality, so it was with the law. Justice Scalia always made sure he built his argument on a solid foundation, the Constitution, the supreme law of the land. As a strong defender of the rule of law, he was a gentle legal giant. Like all great educators, Justice Scalia was respectful of others, regardless of their differing views. "I attack ideas," he once said. "I don't attack people." Some very good people have some very bad ideas, and if you can't separate the two, you got to get another day job. That's a life lesson for all of us who engage in any debates and the ideas that undergird them. In that spirit, Justice Scalia often said, "My best buddy on the court is Ruth Bader Ginsburg, has always been, and Justice Ginsburg's moving tribute to her own best buddy should reduce every bitter partisan to tears." Throughout his life, Justice Scalia correctly inveighed against the notion of a living Constitution, the misguided idea that the Constitution's text and original meaning somehow shifted this way and that with changes in popular attitudes. Justice Scalia said, "There's the argument of constitutional flexibility, and it goes something like this. The Constitution is over 200 years old, and societies change. It has to change with society, like a living organism, or it will become brittle and break. But the Constitution is not a living organism. It is a legal document. It says some things and doesn't say other things. As a lifetime appointed Supreme Court justice, Justice Scalia, like all other lifetime appointed judges, had the opportunity to effectively alter the meaning of the Constitution if he wanted, and could garner the support of 4 of his colleagues. But like George Washington refusing the crown offered him, Justice Scalia rejected the notion the Supreme Court should impose its own preferred policies on the country through strained constitutional interpretations. Instead, Justice Scalia was an ardent defender of democracy, representative democracy. As he said, if you think aficionados of a living Constitution want to bring you flexibility, think again. You think the death penalty is a good idea? Persuade your fellow citizens to adopt it. You want a right to abortion? Persuade your fellow citizens and enact it. That's flexibility. Justice Scalia's respect for Article 1 of the Constitution, the article that begins with these words, all legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in a Congress of the United States, which shall consist of a Senate and House of Representatives. That article, which clearly sets forth the powers of the Congress to legislate, not the executive branch and not the courts, is one of Justice Scalia's greatest legacies. As much as Justice Scalia will be remembered as an able critic of the notion of a living Constitution, he will be remembered for his own living dissents and many majority opinions which will live forever in the hearts and minds of lovers of the law in America and around the world. Thank you, Justice Scalia.
I thank the gentleman for his remarks, and I now yield to my friend, the gentlelady from Missouri, Mrs. Wagner.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank my dear friend and colleague, the gentlewoman from Virginia, Barbara Comstock, for organizing this special order and for yielding me this time. Mr. Speaker, Father Paul Scalia said in his beautiful eulogy of his father, Justice Antonin Scalia, on Saturday, "We give thanks that Jesus brought him to new life in baptism, nourished him with the Eucharist, and healed him in the confessional. God blessed Dad with a deep Catholic faith, the conviction that Christ's presence and power continue in the world today through his body, the Church." Mr. Speaker, last week, our country lost one of its most outspoken and dedicated defenders of faith and liberty. For nearly 30 years, Supreme Court Justice Antonin Scalia stood as a monument to a faith-based viewpoint on the Constitution that will be sorely missed. There is no one in the history of our country who better protected the original intent of our Constitution and upheld the God-given rights of all Americans than Justice Scalia. Shown by his fierce dedication to defending our Constitution, from protecting Americans from government intrusion to protecting the rights of the unborn, Justice Scalia was a man of conviction, a man of passion, and a man of integrity. His honor and vigilance towards the original meaning of the Constitution and his historic dissents will ring throughout history. Every single ounce of Justice Scalia's heart and soul was devoted to our country, his faith, and his family. His wit, his candor, and his character will be missed on our nation's highest court. The legacy of Justice Scalia must never be forgotten. Mr. Speaker, I stand committed today to ensure we continue to prioritize faith and freedom in this country, protecting our natural-born rights as citizens of the United States of America. It is simply the right thing to do. I thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I yield back the rest of my time.
I thank the gentlelady for her remarks, and I now yield to the gentleman from Nebraska, Mr. Fortenberry.
I thank the gentlelady for the time. When I was informed of the justice's death, it came across my electronic devices. I texted my wife back home and I said, I just want to cry. I had the extraordinary privilege of getting to know the justice on a more personal basis. In western Nebraska, there is a large outcropping. It's called Chimney Rock. And Chimney Rock was the place that marks the halfway point across America. When the settlers crossed the great country, when they got to Chimney Rock, they knew that they were halfway along their journey. And in the shadow of that rock, just this last December, I was in a duck blind with Justice Scalia, who, as we all know, had that as an avocation. And when you spend a couple of days in a duck blind with somebody, it's a bonding experience. You get to know them more personally. But in my own reflections about what Chimney Rock meant to the country, a bridge between the past and the future, I thought it appropriately captured the character, the nature, the wisdom of the great justice. He was a great student of American history, our legal system, a great protector of the Constitution and precedents. He understood how important it was to act in a consistent manner with principle while looking forward and applying that principle in ever-changing circumstances of American life. And because he did so with continuity and with consistency, he was a man of great integrity. His inner voice matched his outer voice. And when we saw this beautiful outpouring of support at his funeral from people all across the political aisle, I think the common narrative there was a deep respect for this great man. Mr. Speaker, when he died, I felt like America lost her grandfather. He was a soaring intellect, had an incisive wit, and had, in a certain sense, a humble personality. Loved to share a joke. And for me to have the privilege of spending some time in personal, intimate setting with him, I count as an extraordinary privilege of my time in public service. May God rest his soul. May God grant him peace. May God continue to bless the United States of America and give us all the strength to continue to think through how we are going to elevate and form the next generation of Americans who can apply themselves in such an extraordinary, sacrificial way as Justice Scalia did. With that, I thank you, the gentlelady from Virginia, for the time, and thank you for your beautiful remarks. I remember one other comment I wanted to leave with you. I remember when the justice asked me, he said, "How many children do you have?" You beautifully talked about how he was so devoted to his family and faith. And he asked me, knowing I knew that he had 9, he asked me how many children. I said, "I have 5. He paused.
A good start.
He said, "Respectable." That was it. Anyway, thank you for giving me this moment to honor this great American.
I thank the gentleman for his lovely remarks, and 5, I'd say, is a good start, right? Getting to that 9. And I now yield to the gentleman from New York, Mr. King.
Speaker, I thank the gentlelady for yielding, and I especially thank her for arranging the special order tonight in memory of Justice Scalia, who was truly a legal giant. He was a man who surpassed all of the intellects that I've been aware of in my lifetime. Certainly no one in the legal profession has demonstrated more of a love for the law, more of respect for the law, and more of a respect for the original intent of the Constitution. Now, I have nowhere near the personal contact with Justice Scalia that Barbara Comstock did, or the gentleman from Kansas, Mr. Fortenberry. I did meet him on a number of occasions. I had the opportunity to speak with him. Usually our conversations consisted of talking about the fact that we lived in working-class neighborhoods in Queens. We grew up about a mile apart from each other. We both attended Jesuit high schools, and that's about where the comparison ended as far as the Jesuit high schools, because he was valedictorian and I was far from it. But he was a person who he had the the strength of somebody from the neighborhood, but he had the scholar's intellect. He had the intellect, and it was an intellect, though, that went beyond just tremendous intelligence. It was an intellect which was shaped and framed by a deep religious faith and a belief in undiminished principles and lasting principles, immutable principles. And that's what reflected itself throughout his opinions. And yet, he never let his own feelings or his own prejudices influence the thinking. That was certainly proven in the flag burning case, where if there's anyone who loved his country and would oppose the concept, the act of flag burning, was Justice Scalia. But yet he upheld the act as an expression of free speech as much as it pained him. And it's something that many of us in politics and government have a hard time doing, is following the letter of the law, following the intent of the law, following the meaning of the law. Somehow we like to put our own feelings, our own beliefs in, and the fact is, Justice Scalia told us that there was a higher principle than that. And also, he had such a respect for language. There were no easy words thrown about. There were no escape clauses or phrases. There was an intent and a purpose and a meaning to everything that he did. And to read his opinions, whether in the majority, which made us feel much better when you read, and knowing that he was in the majority, but also when you read his dissents and you realized, again, how determined he was, how forceful he was, and how committed he was to arriving at the correct decision, one which was, again, follow the original intent of the Constitution. Several references, certainly by Barbara Comstock tonight, to his funeral service on Saturday. It, again, was an expression of, by so many people, of their love and respect for such an outstanding human being, a person who I doubt we'll ever see his like again, certainly in our lifetimes. He was a giant of the law. He was a giant of his faith. He was a giant of this country. And I'm proud to join with all my colleagues tonight, especially Barbara Comstock, who arranged this special order, in honoring the memory of Justice Scalia and hoping that that memory lives forward to carry out his unmatched love for the law, love for his country, love for his family and his religion. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman from New York for his kind words and for bringing the New York flavor here to such a wonderful man. And I now yield to the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Walker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd certainly like to thank the gentlewoman from Virginia for taking the initiative to honor such a great man. In 1986, Antonin Scalia was nominated. I was a junior in high school, and I'm not sure it really resonated with me at the time what the next 30 years would entail. I believe it's safe to say that not only is he one of the strongest conservative voices of our day, but could be from all time. I think of his life, and I think of the example that he left for all of us, whether in politics or out. It's one thing to be conservative. It's another thing to be effective. He showed with his life that he did not have to compromise his principles or his values to be effective. When I look at his peers around him, Judge Ginsburg many times talks about the friendship and the relationship that he had with him. It was genuine. Justice Kagan took her hunting, taught her how to hunt, killed her first big deer, first of any kind, there with Justice Scalia at her side. See, what does that tell me? It tells me something that we need to remember, that you can connect with people, you can hold your values, but you can have a genuine love for your fellow man. There's much to be said about Antonin Scalia's faith. Obviously, he lived it. But he lived it in a way that it set an example for all of us. Yes, we get frustrated, and it's okay to be angry sometimes vertically, but never horizontally to our coworkers, our friends, our neighbors, and family. He set the mark. He set it high. Someone that could work in arguably the toughest environment in the world, yet still gain the respect of his political arch rivals. For that, I will thank him. Tonight, I honor him for showing us how to be both conservative and to be effective. Thank you. I yield back my time.
I thank the gentleman for his remarks, and I now recognize the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Roscom.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Representative Comstock, for organizing this tonight. So I just have a quick personal story, Mr. Speaker. Justice Scalia's daughter, Anne, lives in my neighborhood. And I served in the state legislature and learned that this woman whose last name obviously was no longer Scalia was the daughter of Justice Scalia. So I called her up and I said, if your dad is ever in town, I'd love to meet him. I was that guy, Mr. Speaker, who made that call. And she was very gracious. Sometime later, she called me up and said, Peter, my dad's coming in, and why don't you and your family stop by? So the Roskams ran around the corner, my wife Elizabeth and me and our 4 children, who were young at the time. And we went over, and there we spent a few minutes on a Sunday afternoon with Justice Scalia, very magnanimous, very gracious, there in his blue jeans and his sweatshirt, getting up off the couch, but extending himself to us. A couple years later, I won a seat in the U.S. House, and I thought, well, I've got a little bit of a connection. I'll reach out, and I'll call, and I'll try and make a courtesy call. And I made some contact with his chambers, and they said, well, his staff, and they said, well, would you like to come over and listen to an argument? New member of Congress? I said, I'd love to go over. So over I go and listen to an argument in the Supreme Court, and it's very dramatic, as you know. And then I was walking out feeling a little bit let down because I actually wanted to say hello to Justice Scalia, but not to be disappointed. His staff said, well, come on with us. And I go up to his office, and there in his chambers, he set out a lunch, and the two of us just had lunch together. Now, it was not lost on me who I was having lunch with. It was not lost on me the magnitude, the scale, the capacity of this man, and his ability to influence things at a grand scale. And yet he was really willing to spend some time with me that day. And I got to tell you one other quick story. A few years ago, I invited him to dinner. I said, Justice Scalia, I've got a number of my colleagues that would love to have dinner with you. Would you be willing to come out? And of course he did. I told my wife afterward, I said, this guy is so interesting and so charming. If he had a radio show, you would listen to it. You would set your timing so that you could listen to him. He was so interesting, so clever, and so quick, and willing to take all kinds of questions and all kinds of debate and so forth. And I just want to close by saying this. There are many, many times when we feel overwhelmed by events that are before us in our public life. There's many times when our constituents feel overwhelmed and they get this sense of, look, is there anybody out there that's got some level of judgment and wisdom and capacity here? Are there any examples and role models? And the answer is Justice Scalia. He's an example. He's an example that we're all the beneficiaries of. His clear mind, his capacity to disagree without being disagreeable, his capacity to build people up, his capacity to articulate a worldview, his capacity to be a faithful and vocal follower of his Savior Jesus and not be defensive about it, and basically invite people along to celebrate and to participate in this great gift, which is our democracy. Even in these short interactions that I had with him, you always got the sense, or I did, that he got the joke. In other words, there was a twinkle in his eye. Look, this is a democracy and we've got roles to play. His role on the court was to do his thing. Our role, Mr. Speaker, is to legislate with that same sense of commitment and character and tenacity and clarity that Justice Scalia brought to his role on the judiciary. So I want to honor Justice Scalia. I want to honor his wife, Mrs. Scalia. I want to honor his children and grandchildren and thank them because it's a sacrifice for them to have someone of that caliber and that capacity in that role for our country. And it's not a burden that's easy, but they've been willing to bear that burden, and our country is better off for it. So, Mr. Speaker, thank you, and I want to thank the gentlelady from Virginia and yield back the balance of my time.
I thank the gentleman for those lovely memories, and I know so many of the outpouring that we saw in his passing. One of the pictures that I saw from a neighbor was a picture of Justice Scalia when he had probably been coming home for a long day at work, and some local children, some children on our street had lemonade stand. And so he had stopped. He had gotten out there to support those little entrepreneurs, took a picture of that, and then mom came out, took a picture of them, and he's there beaming with those kids, in his suit, all dressed up, and these little kids are there with their lemonade stand, just so proud. He really did take that time that my friend Mr. Roscom spoke about and just really engaged and loved life so much. And now I would like to yield to the gentleman from Florida, Mr. DeSantis.
Well, I thank my colleague from Virginia for organizing this, really a fitting tribute to somebody who really did make a difference, and very few people who serve not only in the judiciary, but really at any level of government leave the lasting mark that Antonin Scalia did. And he will join the likes of John Marshall, Joseph Story, Robert Jackson as one of the all-time greats in American law. And I think that of all the great things you can say about him, he was sharp, he was witty, he wrote brilliantly. I think the reason why he is a titan of modern American law is because he insisted on discharging the judicial duty in a way that strengthened our overall constitutional order. He insisted on textualism when you are interpreting statutes. He had an originalist outlook when you're talking about the constitutional interpretation, and those frames of reference really vindicated the separation of powers. The judicial power under Article 3 is to decide cases and controversies. So you have cases before you, and you got to decide them. It's not to go out and be a roving super legislature. It's not to put your philosophy and impose that on society. You decide cases. And so once judges free their decision-making from the objective meaning of the law and the Constitution, they are taking away power belonging to the American people and that should be exercised through their representatives. And Justice Scalia always understood that, and he was always insistent that judges have an objective standard when they're discharging their duty. So when you talk about textualism, you read the statute for what it says. You don't correct the statute. You don't amend the statute. You don't find subjective views of some random legislature who happened to say something in a committee hearing. You actually apply the words as written, and that is the judicial task. And when you do that, you're basically vindicating the power of the Congress and of the people's elected representatives, because they're the ones that wrote the law. And if the courts depart from that, then they're departing what the elected representatives did. And I'm sure he saw countless statutes that were asinine as a matter of policy, but he said, that's not my job to correct that. And so he is absolutely vindicating the separation of powers in the constitutional order. And the same thing with constitutional interpretation. Before Scalia took the bench, this was a freewheeling thing. Judges would say, society matures and it's up to us to effectively update the meaning of the Constitution. That means you have 5 lawyers, unelected, unaccountable, that serve as an effective roving constitutional convention that can change the Constitution based on one case that happens to come in front of them. And that was something that Justice Scalia thought was totally outside the bounds of the proper judicial role. And so he says the Constitution has a fixed, enduring meaning, and it's our job as judges to ascertain that meaning and apply it to the cases and controversies before us. And so if you look at a figure that has had more impact on how we think about the law and the Constitution over the last 50 years, you are not going to find one that surpasses Justice Antonin Scalia. He was a great American in every respect. He fought the good fight. He finished the race. He kept the faith. What a good guy. What a life. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman, and now I yield to the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Rothfuss.
I thank my colleague, the gentlelady from Virginia, for organizing this special order on behalf of this remarkable American. On February 13th of this year, our country lost a giant. His legacy will never fade. Justice Scalia influenced countless jurists, attorneys, law students, and everyday Americans. My thoughts and prayers have been with the Scalia family, Maureen, his family, Father Paul, since the passing of this outstanding American statesman. Regardless of whether one agreed with his opinions on the Supreme Court, this man's consistent integrity and admirable character cannot be denied. In both word and action, he was a man of strongest character and deepest virtue. This was evident in the commencement address he gave to the graduating class of the College of William and Mary in 1996, when he said, "Bear in mind that brains and learning, like muscle and physical skill, are articles of commerce. They are bought and sold. You can hire them by the year or by the hour. The only thing in the world that is not for sale is character." The way he lived out the virtues of integrity and humility did not go unnoticed. Several weeks ago, we here in Washington had the opportunity to go to the National Prayer Breakfast, which attracted members of Congress, the President, senators, ambassadors, people from all over the world, and we were treated with an appearance by famed tenor Andrea Bocelli. And I think that Justice Scalia would have enjoyed his appearance and his appreciation for opera. In addition to his wonderful renditions of Panis Angelicus, would have been another treat for Justice Scalia, and Amazing Grace, Mr. Bocelli lamented the dark shadow that war casts on the world and expressed concern for its victims, identifying war as a major problem in our world today. But then it was interesting. Mr. Bocelli stated, "There is that small, hateful word, hubris. Already known in antiquity, the ancient Greeks used it to define pride and the arrogance it entails." Bocelli's use of the word hubris was compelling in that he spoke it in the center of power here in the United States. That word conjures a theme that we've seen in Justice Scalia's work. Justice Scalia went about his task of considering significant constitutional and legal issues of the day with a profound and seldom seen humility about the role of courts in our country. They are not there to impose their own beliefs on the people, but to adjudicate competing claims in the context of a constitution that has enduring meaning. To interpret the law in any other way otherwise aggrandizes power to a select few, a power that was never intended by the founders. This humility of position that Justice Scalia had, I believe, will be a lasting legacy. Regardless of whether one agrees with Justice Scalia from a policy perspective, his writings reflect a profound respect for and understanding of our system of government and an unparalleled respect for an interpretation of the Constitution grounded in text and in history. For this, our nation should be forever grateful. May he rest in peace. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman and thank all of my colleagues for their comments. And Mr. Speaker, I really appreciate this opportunity for all of our colleagues to join us in celebrating the life of this great man, Justice Scalia, who so many of us were privileged to know and count as a friend. And for anyone who would like to view the beautiful Mass of Christian burial for Justice Scalia that was presided over by his son, Father Paul Scalia, who gave a beautiful homily, that can be found on C-SPAN, and I appreciate that was covered. And I also, again, appreciate this opportunity to celebrate this beautiful life, this family, and thank you. And with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentlewoman yields.